It's so much more than just the last book in a fantasy trilogy.
Oh, absolutely. It's the conclusion of a world.
And I think the one sentence that really makes this epic worth talking about right now, today, is this. It broke every single fantasy rule to write the difficult, painful truth about survival trauma and, what happens when you finally come home and find your world has changed forever.
That framing is so important because it immediately shifts the focus from, say, the big battles and the spectacle to the psychology of it all.
Right.
We aren't just here to talk about the final fight between good and evil. We're here to analyze why the story's real power, its staying power, is in the quiet moments that come after.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, our mission is really to unpack the source material our listeners shared, and we're focusing on two huge forces that shakes this book's ending.
Two monumental forces.
First, you have the grueling, almost 2-decade-long creation process, 17 years to write The Lord of the Rings.
17 years. It's unbelievable.
And second, there's the profound, inescapable shadow of J.R.R. Tolkien's trauma from World War I.
And that's the core tension we're looking at. It's a really unique one. On one hand, you have Tolkien's academic brain, his total mastery of language, of mythology, that gave Middle-earth its architecture, its structure, its history, its linguistic reality. But then on the other hand, you have his personal experience, the devastating loss, the shadow of the Somme.
And that gave it its heart.
That gave it its profound human and often tragic heart. And that collision, that's what we're talking about. The crash between academic rigor and personal grief is the real engine behind The Return of the King.
It's an incredibly powerful synergy. So before we really dissect those deeper themes, let's just, set the stage. We need a quick overview of this final volume for anyone who might be new to Middle-earth or just needs a refresher.
Great idea.
So a quick summary of The Return of the King.
Well, the first thing to remember is the sheer scope of this thing. It's enormous, and it has a kind of accidental origin.
Right, it wasn't planned this way.
Not at all. The story began way back in 1937, and it was supposed to be a sequel to a charming, pretty lighthearted children's book, The Hobbit.
So the publisher, Stanley Unwin, he's probably expecting more songs and riddles and, fun little adventure.
Exactly. More whimsical adventures with dwarves. And instead, Tolkien delivers this, the dense, complex, world-ending culmination of his entire private mythology.
And what he delivered felt ancient. The moment it came out, it felt like it had existed for centuries, spanning thousands of years of invented history, culture, conflict, and it all just converges into one final desperate struggle.
And the setting is that final stage of the War of the Ring. The stakes are, well, they're total. This is it. The definitive conflict between all the free peoples of Middle-earth men, elves, dwarves, hobbits, against this overwhelming, industrialized military machine.
The machine of the Dark Lord Sauron.
And Sauron's victory means something very specific. It means the eternal domination of his will, the end of free choice, the end of nature, really, across the entire continent.
And to follow this, we're tracking two parallel stories that have to succeed at the same time for anything to work.
Right, they're completely intertwined.
On the grand scale, you have Aragorn. He has to reclaim his destiny as the rightful king of Gondor. He has to unify all these different nations to face Sauron's armies, which are all gathered at the gates of the White City, Minas Tirith.
And that's your classic, high fantasy plot, the returning king, the epic siege.
But at the exact same time, you have this quiet, devastating internal conflict, the quest to destroy the one thing that gives Sauron all his power, the One Ring.
And this burden, this impossible task, falls on the weakest and, least likely heroes imaginable. The hobbits, Frodo Baggins and his companion, Samwise Gamgee.
And they have to attempt this impossible journey right into the heart of the enemy's own land, Mordor.
So it's no wonder the publisher was surprised. The sources make it so clear this was never going to be a children's book. It was called a vast, intricate world, a deeply serious work about heroism, about sacrifice, about language, and I think most uniquely, about loss. The fundamental nature of loss and survival.
He wasn't just telling a story, he was presenting an entire mythological framework.
And that framework, that detail, is what gives the ending its incredible emotional weight. We're not just watching a quest finish, we're seeing the final, deeply personal consequences of a war that has, in this world, consumed history itself.
Okay, so that's the setup. But to really understand Tolkien's vision here, his truly radical vision, we have to get into spoilers.
Oh yeah, we have to.
Because it's here, at the very end of everything, that Tolkien just completely throws out the typical fantasy rulebook about the all-conquering hero.
He really does. The defining moment, it all happens at the cracks of doom, the one place where the quest can be completed.
And after everything Frodo has endured, the starvation, the fear, the constant psychological grinding of the ring,
Unimaginable suffering. He finally reaches his destination. He's there. And he fails.
it's a shocking betrayal of the hero archetype. He doesn't throw the ring in.
No. The power of the ring, at that final moment, it just completely overwhelms his moral strength. He turns and he says, "The ring is mine."
Puts it on, vanishes.
Yeah.
It's the moment where all human will, even the purest and best intentioned will, just collapses under the weight of absolute power.
And that failure,
Yeah.
it forces an intervention. The sources talk about this as a victory that comes through grace.
Right. Not through strength.
Not through strength, not through moral triumph, but through a kind of radical accident involving the creature most corrupted by the ring, Gollum.
Who has followed them all the way there.
Driven by this insane desire, he attacks Frodo, bites the ring and the finger right off Frodo's hand.
It's so visceral. And then in that one moment of just crazed, singular joy, he's got his precious back.
He missteps, he stumbles and falls, taking the ring with him into the fire.
And Sauron is destroyed. Not by the hero's triumph, but by the unintentional final act of the creature he helped create and corrupt.
This is a huge theological and philosophical statement Tolkien is making. If you really break down that narrative choice, the victory is a kind of salvation that comes from completely outside of human power or control.
He's embedding this idea that sometimes, to totally destroy evil, you need more than a hero's will.
You need a kind of divine or maybe karmic accident to set things right. The hero's job, it turns out, wasn't to succeed at that final moment. It was just to get the ring to that final location.
But the genius of the storytelling doesn't stop there. After the big war is over, the armies go home. And Tolkien forces us, the readers, to go home too.
To the scouring of the Shire. This surprising, often criticized final battle.
And this chapter is so essential for Tolkien's theme. I know some readers feel it's anticlimactic after the fall of Sauron,
But it provides the essential psychological and really the social resolution. The fallen wizard, Saruman, he's taken over the Shire, he's polluted it, industrialized it. Weeds are choking the crops, trees are cut down.
it's scarred. It's a metaphor for how war and corruption follow you home. You can't just leave it behind on the battlefield.
And the hobbits, especially Merry and Pippin, who have been changed by their experiences in the wider war, they can't just go back to their comfortable old lives.
They have to use what they've learned.
The wisdom, the toughness, their experience with strategy and resilience, they have to use it to actively heal and defend their own home from this internal corruption that has followed them back.
It's the ultimate statement on what? Self-governance.
Yeah.
On vigilance.
Yes. The journey didn't just save Middle-earth on some grand map. It prepared the smallest, most vulnerable people to protect their own small corner of the world. The lesson is that freedom isn't won just once.
Yeah.
It has to be constantly defended, even against petty tyrants like Saruman.
And all of this leads us to the true, final, and honestly heartbreaking ending. The Grey Havens. Aragorn is crowned king, the world is stable, Sam gets to go home and marry Rosie. Everything seems set up for that perfect, happily ever after ending. But Frodo, he can't settle back in.
He's haunted. The sources really emphasize his recurring pain, both physical and psychological. He gets chronically ill every single year on the anniversary of being stabbed by that Morgul blade on Weathertop.
So his sacrifice, his service, it's left him with this permanent, unhealable trauma.
It has. And so he makes a choice. He boards the last ship of the elves with Gandalf and Bilbo, and he sails away from Middle-earth forever, to the Undying Lands, a place of rest and healing.
And that's the moment. That is the moment Tolkien completely rejects the standard fantasy trope. The hero does not get the simple, perfect ending.
He survives, yes, but he's prominently scarred by his trauma. It's acknowledged, it's honored, but it's never fully overcome in this world.
That image, Frodo sailing into the West, leaving behind the world he saved. It is the essence of why this book resonated so deeply with a post-war generation.
They understood. They understood that some wounds simply cannot be healed in the world that inflicted them.
So to really appreciate that ending, that profound, complex, bittersweet ending, we have to look to the man who wrote it.
We do.
His process was just one of continuous, agonizing struggle. So let's talk about the 17-year burden.
It's genuinely mind-boggling. The sources detail this writing process that goes from 1937 all the way to the final publication in 1954.
Just to put that in perspective, That spans the entire Second World War
Yeah.
and the beginning of the Cold War.
And over those years, the manuscript just grew. Longer, denser, more intricate, as one source puts it. It evolved from a simple kid's story into this vast historical mythology.
17 years. I mean, that's longer than many classic authors spent on their entire careers. What was at the core of that struggle? Why did it take so long?
Well, it wasn't procrastination. It was this relentless perfectionism that was almost like a creative prison for him. Tolkien felt what he called a terrifying responsibility to his creation. Middle-earth wasn't just a story for him. It was a realization of his private languages, his private mythologies. So every name, every detail, had to be historically and linguistically perfect within its own internal logic.
I think every creative person can relate to that feeling of being trapped by your own standards. He was constantly revising, throwing out entire sections, just perfecting. And one detail that really strikes me from the sources is the sheer size of the appendices.
Oh, the appendices, yes. The appendices to The Return of the King, which have genealogies, timelines, calendars, detailed explanations of the languages. They are, on their own, longer than most standalone novels.
Which just goes to show his struggle wasn't just to finish the plot.
No, it was to provide this exhaustive, scholarly framework to make the fictional world feel real, lived in.
And how did he even manage this? He wasn't a full-time author. He was an Oxford professor with, a pretty heavy teaching load.
His method was intense and physically demanding. He worked late into the night after his teaching duties were done, writing in pencil on whatever paper he could get his hands on.
And he wasn't wealthy?
He had a modest salary, so the financial pressure to deliver this long-promised sequel was very real. You can see it in the letters from his publisher, Stanley Unwin, which become, more and more pointed over the years, though always very polite.
So we have this picture of the calm, erudite Oxford Don. But underneath it all, he's battling this creative monster. Was that pressure just intellectual, or did it affect him physically?
Oh, the sources paint a picture of severe personal challenges, especially in the late 1940s when he was just desperately trying to bring the whole thing to a close.
Oh, what's going on?
His vision was deteriorating badly. He was suffering from intense eye strain, a lot of pain. He was also on pain medication, and the combination of the exhaustion and the medication, it led to some serious psychological strain.
Like what?
Hallucinations and crippling anxiety.
That is profound. To imagine fighting this immense creative battle while also dealing with severe physical pain and psychological breakdown.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems impossible that he ever finished.
Yeah, despite that crisis, he pushed through. He finally wrote the end on the main story in 1949.
But even then, he couldn't let it go.
The perfectionist couldn't rest, no. He spent the next 5 years polishing, cross-referencing, and, crucially, finishing those incredibly dense appendices before it was finally published in 1954.
So the triumph of The Return of the King, it came at a huge personal cost.
A near creative and physical collapse. It was truly a 17-year labor of love and of agony.
And that brings us right to the source of so much of that agony, the trauma he was processing through every single one of those 17 years.
Yes. To understand the trauma in Frodo, you have to understand the trauma in Tolkien. His life, and by extension Middle-earth, was just irrevocably shaped by his service in World War I.
And this really begins with his own real-life fellowship, the TCBS, the Tea Club, and Barovian Society.
The TCBS was Tolkien's closest circle of friends from school. They were all young men, artists, scholars who shared his passion for language and mythology and art.
Their big dreams.
Huge dreams. They were intellectually ambitious, and they made this pact that they were going to change the world through their creative work. They saw themselves as the start of a whole new literary movement.
But that dream, that pact, it was just brutally shattered.
Completely. Tolkien was commissioned as a 24-year-old second lieutenant. He was deployed as a signals officer to the Western Front, and specifically to the Battle of the Somme in 1916.
And for anyone who doesn't know, the Somme it's arguably the definitive darkest moment of industrial warfare.
The horror of it is almost unimaginable. On the very first day of the battle, July 1st, 1916, 20,000 British soldiers were killed in one day.
And Tolkien was right in the middle of it. As a signals officer, he was part of the communication network, constantly exposed to the mechanized violence, the shelling, the gas attacks, the sheer scale of this senseless, muddy, dehumanizing conflict.
He wasn't always on the front line with a rifle, no, but he was constantly writing messages, setting up communication lines in areas under intense shelling. He was directly exposed to all that chaos and waste.
And then he got sick.
He contracted trench fever, a debilitating illness carried by lice, and was sent home to recover in November 1916. And this is where that survivor's guilt starts to form, a thread that runs straight from Tolkien to Frodo.
Because while he was safe at home, recovering,
The news arrived. His two closest friends from the TCBS, Jeffrey Smith and Rob Gilson, had been killed in battle.
his fellowship was obliterated.
It was. He survived, but he carried the deep wounds of the trenches and this profound guilt of surviving when his friends didn't. He carried that with him for the rest of his life.
And this is where we have to talk about that big debate, the idea of allegory versus applicability.
Right. Tolkien was absolutely adamant that The Lord of the Rings was not an allegory.
He writes it right in the foreword. He says he cordially disliked allegory in all its forms. He much preferred history with its varied applicability. Why is that distinction so important?
Because applicability means the war wasn't a direct one-to-one code. Mordor isn't Germany, Sauron isn't Hitler. That's too simple. Instead, the war provided the emotional and the psychological architecture for his entire moral universe.
So the trauma, the loss, the mud, the noise, the despair.
It saturated his creative wellspring. The experience informed the landscape of his world, the psychology of his characters, and the fundamental moral challenges they all had to face.
And we see such clear evidence of this in the book. The imagery of the dead marshes, for instance. That's one of those direct connections.
It's the ultimate visual parallel. Frodo and Sam are trudging through these stagnant, murky marshes, and they look down into the water and see the faces of long-dead warriors, perfectly preserved, with their eyes open. It's this image of haunting eternal loss.
And the source material confirms that Tolkien saw similar, unspeakable things at the Somme.
Yes, shell craters that filled with water, revealing the faces of fallen soldiers just beneath the surface. He took that horrifying reality of the trench landscape and embedded it directly into Middle-earth.
And you see that same industrial horror in Mordor itself, a land stripped bare, where the only thing being produced are instruments of war and domination.
It's the antithesis of the pastoral shire, just as the trenches were the antithesis of the English countryside.
But the most profound connection has to be Frodo's post-war state, his unhealed wounds.
Absolutely. Because when Tolkien was fighting in 1916, society had no words for what we now call PTSD. Soldiers were just expected to come home and carry on. The whole stiff upper lip, they called it shell shock, but they had no real framework for understanding it or treating it.
So Tolkien had to process what his society couldn't even name through his art.
Exactly. Frodo comes home, but he's haunted, he can't settle. And that recurring sickness on the anniversary of his wounding, that poisonous spiritual attack from the Morgul blade, it's a perfect literary personification of a veteran suffering from chronic PTSD and survivor's guilt.
It's a remarkable act of emotional truth-telling. Lacking the language of therapy, Tolkien created a fantasy story where the hero's internal wounds were honored as real, as permanent. He gave a generation a metaphor for the pain they were forbidden to speak about.
And that psychological landscape leads us right into the central themes of The Return of the King.
What makes a true king? What is the nature of true heroism? And as we've already touched on, Tolkien's answers are just radically subversive for epic fantasy.
The entire foundation of Aragorn's final arc is built on this one subversive line of prophecy. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer.
In a genre that is so often focused on might, on conquest, on who has the strongest claim by blood, this puts humility and service at the absolute peak of moral authority.
Aragorn is the heir. He's the last descendant of ancient kings. But he spent decades in the wilderness as Strider, a humble ranger.
And when he finally gets to Minas Tirith during the big siege, the city is just reeling from the battle. A conventional hero would seize the throne, rally the troops, assert his dominance.
But he rejects that impulse entirely. He doesn't go for the crown. He goes straight to the houses of healing. He uses the herb Athelis, or kingsfoil, to personally tend to the wounded. He heals Faramir, Merry, and Eowyn.
So it's not his sword that proves his legitimacy, it's his healing touch.
The prophecy is fulfilled through an act of profound humility and service. His authority comes from his willingness to serve the lowest and most injured among his people.
And you can contrast that directly with Denethor, the steward of Gondor.
Oh, absolutely. Denethor embodies a corrupt form of leadership. He is all pride, paranoia, and this fatal belief in his own superiority. He doesn't want to serve his people. He sees them as resources to be spent.
And the Palantir, the Seeing Stone, is key here. Denethor uses it to spy on Sauron's forces, and he sees their overwhelming might. But that knowledge doesn't make him wise.
It drives him to despair and to madness. Denethor's downfall is this crucial lesson in leadership. He seeks domination through knowledge and force, but because he lacks humility, the knowledge he gets from the stone is corrupted by Sauron's influence.
He only sees the darkness.
And he despairs, and chooses to burn himself alive rather than continue his stewardship. Aragorn, on the other hand, focuses on the immediate, tangible act of healing and providing hope.
In a world that is constantly debating what leadership should look like, Tolkien's vision is still incredibly potent. True leadership is defined by service and the willingness to heal.
And that theme is just amplified by how the main villain, Sauron, is structured. He's not just a monster in a tower. He represents the ultimate force of domination, of industrialization, of the total will to power.
Mordor is the physical manifestation of that. It's not just barren, it's actively polluted. It's a factory for mechanized war, stripped bare of all natural life.
Wow.
A dark echo of the battlefields of the Somme.
And the ring itself is the material embodiment of that impulse to force your will onto others. It doesn't offer you magic wishes, it offers you absolute control.
Which is why all the wise characters, Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond, they know they have to reject it, because to use it, even with good intentions, means you just become the next Dark Lord.
So the moral imperative is crystal clear. The only way to defeat Sauron is to totally, absolutely reject and destroy the ring, to destroy power itself.
And that's why the character of Faramir, Denethor's younger son, is so important.
He's the moral foil to his brother, Boromir, who was corrupted by the idea of using the ring to help Gondor.
Faramir explicitly says he wouldn't take the ring, even if he found it lying on the highway. He symbolizes that conscious moral choice to reject the temptation of domination.
And yet, even with that high moral standard, we come back to that devastating paradox at the end. The hero, Frodo, fails.
Which reinforces the idea that absolute power is just an irresistible corruption. It can't be overcome by human strength alone.
It is the ultimate statement on human fallibility. Tolkien is embedding this idea that salvation often relies on grace, on the unexpected, rather than on the perfect execution of human will. The human will, in the face of absolute power, will eventually fail.
Which brings us to the true moral center of the entire story, Samwise Gamgee.
The gardener.
He has no royal blood, no grand destiny, no prophecy about him. His virtues are the simplest and ultimately the most enduring. Loyalty, love, and faithfulness.
Sam is the foundational hero. He's the counterpoint to the grand, tragic figures like Aragorn and Frodo. His heroism isn't defined by a glorious battle, but by consistent, humble acts of service and kindness and just sheer endurance.
He's the common man who just chooses to keep going.
And the defining moment of heroism in the entire mythology. It's not a sword fight, it's not a magical showdown. It happens on the slopes of Mount Doom. Frodo just collapses, physically and spiritually broken.
And Sam, who can't destroy the ring, he can't even lessen his burden on Frodo, he says those 6 immortal words.
I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you.
And he lifts his master onto his back and keeps climbing. That act of shared suffering, of unwavering service, that's the moral anchor of Tolkien's whole universe.
It perfectly reflects that deep, intense loyalty forged between soldiers in the trenches, bound together by shared suffering and a total dependence on each other. It's the ultimate expression of selfless love.
And then we get to that profound quiet at the very end, the bittersweet return. After everything, Sam gets home to the Shire. He sees his wife, Rose, and his daughter, Eleanor, and he just says, well, I'm back.
And those 3 words, they contain everything.
They encapsulate the ultimate heroism, don't they? He's been to the end of the world. He's seen true evil. He's lost his dearest friend to the west. And yet, he chooses to keep living.
He accepts the bittersweet reality and returns to his duty as a gardener, a husband, a father. Tolkien is suggesting that the highest form of heroism isn't achieving the quest, but the quiet faithfulness to your ordinary life afterwards. The choice to keep serving and healing the little patch of land you love.
Okay, let's pivot now to the foundation that makes all of this feel so real, so authoritative. It's Tolkien's genius as a philologist, a scholar of language, that sets his work apart from everything else.
This is such a crucial distinction to make. Most authors, they invent characters, a plot, and then maybe they sprinkle in some funny-sounding names. Tolkien did the opposite. He invented entire, fully functional languages first, and then he created a world where those languages could be spoken. Historically, culturally, geographically.
And we're not talking about simple codes. These are fully functional languages. Grammar, complex phonology, syntax.
And different historical stages of development, just like the difference between Old English and Modern English. His expertise in ancient tongues, Old English, Norse, Gothic, and especially Finnish and Welsh, was the bedrock for all of it.
Let's get specific. There's Quenya.
Right, Quenya, the ancient high language of the elves. It's heavily influenced by Finnish. It's very musical, very formal, with long flowing vowel sounds.
And by the time of the Return of the King, it's mostly used for ceremony and poetry.
Exactly. And then you have Sindarin, which is the common elvish tongue. That one has a distinct Welsh influence, especially in how its consonants shift and mutate. The level of detail is so immense that some characters are speaking languages separated by thousands of years of fictional linguistic evolution.
Like a modern English speaker listening to someone speak Latin.
Precisely. Now, contrast all that musical beauty with the black speech of Mordor.
Which he deliberately made ugly.
Deliberately harsh, guttural, and functionally ugly. He used specific sounds and consonant clusters like ooh and hard bar sounds that just sound unpleasant and domineering.
So the language's very sound reflects its moral nature.
Exactly. Elvish sounds beautiful and immortal. Black speech sounds ugly and evil. He spent years making sure the very phonetics conveyed the moral weight of the speaker.
And this depth gives so much weight to every big moment. When Aragorn is finally crowned and he takes his true name, Elisar.
The authority of that moment is tied to the fact that Elisar is linguistically real. It's built on Sindarin principles. It means something like Elfstone.
And that detail is everywhere. Every name, every place. Eowyn literally means horse joy in Old English. When they speak, they're speaking with the weight of thousands of years of invented, but internally consistent history.
He even had to invent a whole preceding mythology, the Silmarillion, mostly just to provide a history for how these languages developed and changed over time. It was an act of scholarly dedication that few writers have ever even attempted.
It makes the book feel less like fantasy and more like a translated history. And this all ties into this faith, right? The religious implications of language.
Deeply. Tolkien was a devout Catholic, and in his mythology, creation itself is tied to language. The world was sung into being by the divine creator. So words have power. They're tied directly to the act of creation.
Which means Sauron's corruption of language, the black speech, is a parallel to the corruption of creation itself.
Yes. The inscription on the ring, written in that harsh, authoritative black speech, isn't just a spell. It's a primal corruption of the creative act. His linguistic genius serves the thematic purpose perfectly.
So, having established those twin forces of language and trauma, let's look deeper at the characters who carry that weight.
We have to start with Frodo Baggins, the haunted survivor.
As we've discussed, his character arc is that essential link back to Tolkien's post-WWI experience.
He is the living embodiment of war trauma. He saved Middle-earth, but the experience shattered him. The sources really reinforce this connection, that his trauma reflects the lack of therapeutic language back in 1916.
His inability to find peace, that chronic sickness every year on the anniversary of the Morgul blade wound.
It's a textbook literary reflection of chronic PTSD, of shell shock.
And that wound is so powerful because it's not just a physical one. It's a spiritual poisonous attack. It leaves this permanent, invisible mark on his soul.
Which perfectly mirrors the kind of psychological wounds that can't be seen but are permanent and debilitating.
He's the tragic hero who paid the ultimate price. His victory cost him his ability to go back to his normal life.
And that permanent mark of trauma required him to, well, metaphorically sail away to the undying lands to find peace. A sanctuary where healing is possible because the stressor, the world of his trauma, has been permanently removed.
Now contrast that tragic destiny with Samwise Gamgee, the enduring heart.
Their relationship is so critical, it goes way beyond a traditional master-servant dynamic.
It's that deep, life-defining bond forged between soldiers who share absolute suffering and dependence in the trenches. Sam's loyalty isn't born of duty, it's forged in the fire of shared trauma.
Sam is the grounding element. He never succumbs to the ring's temptation, partly because his desires are so simple, a garden, a home, a family, and partly because his moral compass is based entirely on that selfless devotion to his friend.
His heroism is in his profound moral simplicity. He's the one who chooses life.
He suffers the loss of his friend, he sees the horror, but he accepts the bittersweet reality and returns to his duty, to preserve and cherish the small things that actually matter. He's the veteran who successfully reintegrates by finding solace in the small, necessary acts of daily life.
And to really ground this, let's just reiterate how those specific images from the Somme were used in the text.
Tolkien channeled the real-life horrors he saw directly into the fantasy. We mentioned the dead marshes, but also think about the orcs. Tolkien denied allegory, but the orcs are these dehumanized, mass-produced soldiers of Sauron, stripped of free will and identity. a reflection of the mechanized war machine that reduced men to cannon fodder. The sheer, senseless scale of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields provides that emotional backdrop for the trauma Frodo carries, making his internal journey resonate with real-world suffering.
So after 17 years of this creative struggle, when The Return of the King is finally published in 1954, what was the reaction?
It was an immediate cultural sensation. You have to remember that fantasy, as a serious genre, barely existed at the time. Critics praised it as a monumental achievement. They recognized the sheer scale and depth of the world building.
But there was also some dismissal, wasn't there? Particularly from the literary elite.
There was. Some of the highbrow critics dismissed the work precisely because it was fantasy, which they just saw as escapist or low literature. They often overlooked the deep linguistic architecture or found the appendices to be, unnecessary.
They missed the point.
They completely missed the profound thematic core of trauma and recovery that underpins the entire work.
But regardless of any critical snobbery, its influence on culture is just. It's hard to overstate. It didn't just popularize the fantasy genre, it basically codified it. Every fantasy novel written since 1954 is in its shadow. But beyond the genre, why does this story still matter so much 70 years later?
I think its relevance comes down to two profound contributions that were way ahead of their time. First, the radical themes of leadership.
Huh.
By making Aragorn's proof of kingship an act of healing, Tolkien offered this enduring model of true authority. It was a necessary counterpoint to the domination-obsessed leaders who had devastated the 20th century.
And second, and this is maybe more crucial for us today, it provided a necessary framework for talking about trauma, about unhealable psychological wounds.
It truly anticipated modern psychological vocabulary. It gave a language, a metaphor, a cultural touchstone for veterans and their families to understand why the hero couldn't just come home and be normal.
Frodo's fate, sailing into the West.
It was a bold, honest acknowledgement that some sacrifices permanently change a person, and that sometimes you need sanctuary and distance to find peace.
It deals honestly with the pain of loss and the deliberate choice to keep living, which is a truly universal human experience. It's why the story can still break your heart while also validating your own struggles. Okay, so let's unpack this for the listener, for the learner who really appreciates the process as much as the final product. What's the key takeaway from that grueling 17-year struggle to create this?
I think it's the importance of relentless persistence and the ultimate necessity of finishing even when you're afraid it's not perfect. Tolkien's 17-year battle is this reminder that the struggle to create something vast and meaningful is worth the agony. Sometimes the only way out of that perfectionist prison is the discipline to just write the end and let the work speak for itself.
Here's what I find really interesting, and I want to hear your take on this. That profound paradox at the climax. The hero fails, and it leads to an accidental victory. Is Tolkien really saying that our moral purity is irrelevant to salvation?
That is the essential question. Tolkien, as a man of deep faith, embedded this concept that human will is inherently fallible. The ring's destruction teaches us that the greatest victory required the ultimate accident or grace, mediated by the very evil that the ring had corrupted.
So it suggests that salvation, these monumental world-changing events, they sometimes depend on forces beyond our own intentional strength.
Exactly. Frodo's moral job was to get the ring there. Gollum's desperate accidental action was the necessary and inevitable consequence of the ring's own corrupting nature.
So what does this all mean for us today as we're dealing with our own burdens, big and small?
Well, if you have ever watched something sail away, a dream, a person, a relationship, a version of yourself, and you've had to turn around and choose to keep going, then this book resonates. Sam's choice to go home after achieving the impossible and losing his dearest friend is the ultimate statement on choosing life, on choosing service and continuity. That faithfulness in the face of profound loss is the most practical form of heroism Tolkien offers us.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Tolkien believed that some wounds cannot be healed in Middle-earth, which is why Frodo had to sail away to the Undying Lands, a metaphorical sanctuary.
So consider this. What permanent, unhealable wounds or forms of trauma do we recognize in modern life? Things like chronic illness, complex grief, moral injury, things that might require a physical or metaphorical sailing away to find lasting peace.
It really makes you think about what true sanctuary or recovery means in a world that so often demands immediate, complete healing. So we've taken a deep dive into The Return of the King. We've covered the World War I crucible that forged its soul, the linguistic genius that builds its reality, and the radical heroism found not in conquest, but in service and humility.
We really focused on the applicability of its themes. That explicit rejection of domination and the value of humility are such enduring lessons for today's social landscape. Aragorn's ultimate proof of kingship wasn't victory, it was healing. That is such a vital message.
In that final defining moment, the highest point of heroism, it wasn't a sword raised high. It was a simple gardener opening his front door and saying 3 small words after surviving the impossible. Well, I'm back. So as you go about your day, think about what true heroism looks like in your own life. Often, it's just the quiet faithfulness to choose to keep living and to keep tending your own garden.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the extraordinary burden and triumph of J.R.R. Tolkien's masterpiece.
Until next time, keep reading, keep learning, and keep asking those deep questions about the cost of victory.